Yeah, I too would. Oh, thank you. I too would like to acknowledge that we're standing, or this meeting is taking place on the stolen land of the Gadigal people. I think it's something that I want to talk about a bit in my talk, because I think it's one of the key injustices that exist here in Australia, that the Indigenous people have had the land stolen from them, that they've been, subject to genocide. That genocide is not just a historical fact, as much as the right would make it out to be the case, but it is an ongoing project. And to stand in solidarity with their struggles, to recognise that sovereignty was never ceded, I think is a very important thing for anybody that stands on the left of politics, as I'm sure you all do. So I just thought I'd start by saying, as a young anti-capitalist activist, a perspective on social justice mostly centres around the lack of social justice in this system. And, there's a lot of things that I can point to as being part of that. There's the injustice of global poverty. I've got some statistics here which are quite shocking. 1.3 billion people, or more than that, actually live in extreme poverty, as defined as the rate of $1.25 US every day. The UNICEF estimates that 22,000 children die every day from poverty-related causes. And, you've got pockets of intense poverty, like the sub-Saharan region of Africa. They've not become more wealthy, but actually more poor over the course of the last 30 years. There's also, it was a key thing for me growing up, the injustice of war, that wars periodically, there's conflagrations in whole sections of the globe every now and again. The Middle East wars, there was part of my political awakening, part of many people's political awakening. The talk about the sanctions on Iraq imposed by the UN on behalf of the most powerful nation in the world, the US. It killed almost, actually more than 500,000 children from malnutrition and starvation in the early 90s. And when I was young, the destruction of Afghanistan and Iraq, led by the US, cheered on by the Australian government, those things, I think, really show the sheer barbarity of the world order. And I think it's precisely what you can see within the US, the most powerful state, that kind of provides a key for understanding these kinds of injustices. It's a society that's a microcosm of what's going on in the rest of the world. And I looked up some more statistics. I'm a fan of statistics, so I used to do science. So according to Thomas Piketty, in the last 30 years, wages for the bottom 50% of incomes have not increased, while the incomes of the top 1% have grown by 300%. And so Oxfam's statistic for the world is saying in the last 25 years, the top 1% of people have gained more income than the whole bottom 50% put together. So incredibly shocking statistics. And I think the injustice, it doesn't just lie in the inequality itself. It's more that the money that the 1% is getting is not coming from a magic money tree. It's certainly not coming from their hard work and ingenuity. It's actually coming from the labour of the majority. So the structure of capitalist society is constantly producing a transfer of wealth from the bottom of society to the top. And the structure that I'm talking about is production for the market. Things don't just get produced because people need them, certainly not if you're living in sub-Saharan Africa. Things actually get produced for the profits of a very small minority of people in society. Wealth doesn't just exist to service the majority of people who live on this planet. And of course, like I said, they exploit workers to get it. They don't do the work themselves. I think there's a huge amount of injustice in this world setup, where there's a section of the population that literally parasites of the rest. And the penalty rates decision that Isabella referenced, I think, is a key example in Australia of that transfer of wealth. The biggest wage cut since the Great Depression. Some people will be worse off by $7,000 a year. I think it's absolutely disgusting. And I think, this is the key injustice that informs all of the rest. A fundamentally unequal class setup that privileges the few over the many. But it isn't just about grand global problems like poverty or war. I think this setup leads to injustices in Australia as well. And the institutions that prop up this system all over the world exist within our national boundaries also. And there are many examples, even in very recent times, about how these institutions perpetrate injustice. And the sick thing is, it's often the institutions that are supposed to be purveyors of justice that treat people in the most unjust ways. So, talking about Indigenous oppression, you find that there's no justice in the way that Indigenous people are treated by the police, by the courts in this country. So they're incarcerated at a rate 13 times higher than non-Indigenous people when standardised for age, and they're forced to fight for justice when racist killers are let off the hook by the courts. So we've had last year 14-year-old Elijah Doherty, he was killed. He's white supremacist, vigilante murderer, and these are established facts. He got off with reckless driving. And actually last Wednesday, my dad lives in Tamworth, in the Tamworth Correctional Facility, Tane Chatfield. He was in prison there for almost 2 years, not because he was even found guilty of any crime. He was on remand. And when he died, he's a year my junior. And one of my comrades, actually sitting right here in Socialist Alternative, he's a cousin to the Borrowville Three. If people are unfamiliar with the story, 3 children who disappeared and whose killer has never been brought to justice. These are just some examples of the injustice that Indigenous people are faced with in this country. And to kind of bring it back to the penalty rates issues as well, when workers team up together in unions to try and fight for justice in terms of wages and working conditions, they find of the whole of what is considered to be, justice in capitalist society, so in this case, the industrial courts and the police, they come crashing down upon them to stop strikes, to stop any kind of fight back from going on. And justice in this country says that the construction company Grocon, they're really famous in Melbourne. I'm using a lot of Melbourne examples because that's where I'm from. Grocon, this guy, he's one of the richest men in Melbourne. He's rewarded by the state when his workers strike for basic safety conditions by having picket lines smashed up by riot police and horses, but they only received a slap on the wrist of $250,000 when an unsafe wall that they constructed fell and killed 3 bystanders, as what happened in Carlton in 2013, just down the road from Melbourne University where I used to study. And those 3 were actually students. And so, you can see that there's an incredible amount of injustice in the ways that corporations are treated as opposed to ordinary people trying to fight for their living conditions. And I think in a capitalist legal system which supposedly runs on the principle of fair trial, for many there's no justice to be had at all. And mostly the people who are put through the courts or served by the police are there just because of crimes of poverty anyway. Petty theft, homelessness, these are only crimes that can affect those who are in dire need of income, really. And equality before the law, I think, is meaningless in this class-divided situation that I described. And that's not just in America, that's also in the lucky country as well. Furthermore, I don't think there's anything just about the whole regime of refugee detention and torture that the Australian government set up in the 90s, the Keating government set up and continues to run. The human trafficking of detainees to the US for the political gain of the Turnbull government is just the latest example in this horrendous story. It's the refugee torture system and also the way that Muslims are demonised and persecuted that allows for the erosion of what little amount of justice we do have access to in this system. It's been a case for some time now that if you're a Muslim and you're guilty until proven innocent under the law, because those charged with terrorism, which is pretty much solely defined as Islamic radicalism, if you're as young as 14, you can be detained for 2 weeks without any charge whatsoever. And this disgusting discrimination isn't just simply that, it also allows a dangerous precedent for how other groups in society can be treated. So I already talked a bit about anti-union busting, and the Australian Building and Construction Commission, which was reintroduced last year again, it has the right to request information of unionists, and if they don't comply, they can be imprisoned without charge. This is the same commission that's heavily skewed towards the bosses, having been introduced in the first place to restore the rule of law violated by the construction union, the CFMEU, on work sites, i.e. actually trying to provide for workers' safety and conditions and fight for them. Another way of maintaining the system, I think, is refusing the people the right to equality in marriage. I think it's an injustice that almost defies belief at the moment, considering the overwhelming public support for same-sex marriage. LGBTI people are still denied this basic civil right, which, of course, currently thousands of people across the country are campaigning hard to achieve, thousands of young people. Denying LGBTI people the right to marry cements their oppression in other arenas of life and keeps a whole section of the population downtrodden on the basis of something that's so intimately a part of who they are. I think it's legitimately disgusting. Therefore, I think oppression of refugees, Muslims, LGBTI people, they're some of the things that the people who rule over this class-divided society do in order to maintain it. If those who rule can legitimise violence towards refugees, it undermines the sense of solidarity with those from across national borders. If those who rule can say that refugees and Muslims are the enemy, they can make sure that the real enemy of workers in Australia, the 1%, can get off the hook. And if racism and sexual oppression can keep whole swathes of the population feeling downtrodden and powerless, the better those who rule over us can keep us feeling powerless as well. And these kinds of injustice are essentially about social control, and I think they're the ugly outgrowth of a highly unequal system. So you can see there's injustice on basically every level of this picture of society, and I could really go on and on and on and on and on about all the injustices that capitalism perpetrates. But as I said at the start, or perhaps I did, I'm not sure, I'm a Marxist, and the good thing about a Marxist perspective is that it's not just a critique, it's not just about critiquing capitalist society, but finds in an analysis of those structures an alternative. So the injustice of inequality, of war, of poverty, of oppression, as I said, it comes from the fabric of capitalist society, that is exploitation of workers and a profit-driven economy, a profit-driven system. And I think in that context, it's not really surprising that the picture that Isabella painted, that things are getting worse and worse and worse, and the political representatives of capitalism, like the Liberal Party, are trying to drive workers into the dust. And I think therefore, to find justice, the threads of society actually have to be unravelled. The whole system, including all of this institutions, some of which I've described, they need to be abolished. I think a new society which doesn't contain these injustices needs to be formed in its stead. So I'll just talk about how we make a new kind of society. As I said earlier, capitalism revolves around the injustice that the processes required to make society run are performed not by the capitalists who control them, but by the mass of workers. And this is an injustice, but also a source of potential as well. It would be a much more just society if the mass of workers organise society in their own interests. They already make everything run anyway. And a society organised by the majority for the majority is an alternative to a society run in the interests of a tiny parasitic layer of capitalists. And that's what socialism, I think, is all about. I think to get to this point, the mass of workers have to take the reins. Their activity needs to break the hold of capitalist institutions, and they must organise new ones to express their will and to run society, instead of the clapped-out institution of Parliament, which has basically only perpetuated a lot of the injustice I've talked about already. So I'm talking about revolution. It's not a word that gets mentioned much in mainstream society, but young people are increasingly won to that idea in the US and other places across the world. I think the slow, steady march of history hasn't been enough to right the wrongs of capitalist society. In fact, as the statistics on global inequality show, things are actually getting worse and worse and worse, even on a grand scale. And the only thing that's accelerated the progress of justice has been struggle. It's been the periods of deepest struggle that have rectified historic wrongs, like the fight against slavery in the US and later the civil rights movement, the struggle against Saddam and other forms of autocracy around Europe 100 years ago, and against the war on Vietnam. And revolution is taking this struggle one step further and removing the structures that create these injustices in the first place. And I think this revolutionary perspective is important and a big difference from the typical argument about how change is supposed to happen, and which Isabella rightly points out, that young people are increasingly disillusioned with. For starters, the injustice of capitalism is not necessarily seen as something fundamental to it. This encourages the perspective that the system can be transformed through the institutions that run it. And I think the key one, as I've said, is Parliament, often perpetuating injustice. I say that because Parliament mostly serves as a smokescreen of democratic participation when the key decisions about society are actually just made in the interests of the 1% and determined elsewhere. The political forces that engage with this institution can only accommodate to those interests in the end, since Parliament only exists with the goodwill of those with economic and social power. And even in Australia's recent political history, we've seen what can happen when those interests are contravened by politicians. So, for example, when the Labor government under Rudd proposed a very, very mild tax on the gigantic profits of the mining corporations, a campaign was mounted by the right until his government was replaced. And yeah, like I said, like many young people, I do not see electing a Labor government as an alternative to the status quo, since they participate in it. And similarly, the Greens have proved to be far less of a radical force than the rabid right writing for The Australian makes them out to be. They participated in a Labor coalition at the federal level for years without any tangible gains for refugee rights, marriage equality, or any other kind of social issues. I think the steps that we take towards revolution will involve trying to broaden and deepen every struggle against injustice, big or small. I think we need mass movements against racism, for example, to open the borders, close the camps and free the refugees. We need mass movements against economic inequality, involving strikes that spread across workplaces and across the country. And the demand for justice is always a key slogan for mobilising movements. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US demanded justice for Trayvon Martin, for Michael Brown, for Freddie Gray, for Eric Garner, for Scott Walker, and many more besides. Mobilising people young and old, I've got to say, the generational divide is I think, less important than the fact that we want to mobilise people to be involved in protest movements, and that's the project that I'm involved in as a young socialist activist today. I think the key frontier in Australia at the moment is the fight for same-sex marriage. The socially conservative wing of those who rule us have clung on tenaciously to this discrimination. They're pretty afraid to give it up, lest they grant a victory for our side. Because it really won't go down in history as something that our benevolent overlords handed down to us. It would be a victory for the long-running protest campaign that has seen tens of thousands now march through the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. And my organisation, a Socialist Alternative, has been pretty key to this fight from the beginning in 2004 when it was banned with bipartisan support. We argued a couple of things from the get-go. For example, that it should be a protest campaign that would win. We've seen others try to persuade politicians from Labor and even the Liberals to support same-sex marriage, trying to flatter moral consciences that I didn't really know that they had. So none of this has really worked. The Labor Party in office had no intention of granting this civil right, and it's only recently that they've jumped on the bandwagon. And that's because protests have occurred that have tried to involve as many people as possible, to be as participatory as possible, and have swung public opinion over from a minority into an overwhelming majority on our side. And I think it's been good during the plebiscite as well, or the postal survey as I should say, that the unions, still the biggest mass progressive organisations in the country, have been at the forefront of the campaign as well. And it's vindicated one of our arguments that we've made from the beginning, that this isn't just about love. It's certainly not really about marriage. It's about the right to equality and opposing oppression. That's the oppression that's been driven by the right in this country. And I think this is a great model for what movement building should look like and how we can achieve progressive change. And I think if we want to see more justice in society and work towards the new one where there is no injustice, that's what the task for young activists is. And I will continue to organise as many young people as possible in that fight.